Thank you so much for joining us for today's Connected Conversation, a program conducted by the Idaho Humanities Council. If you're not familiar with our organization, I encourage you to check out our website, idahohumanities.org. I'd like to remind you all that you may submit any questions using the Q&A feature located at the bottom of the screen or the chat feature also at the bottom of the screen. With me today is Eric Hadley from Boise State. It's an honor to have you with us today, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Doug. And thank you to the Idaho Humanities Council for inviting me back to do a presentation. I was lucky enough to be able to do one in February on the topic of Hawaiian and Native American connections in terms of land sovereignty movements, and that worked out really well. And I'm pleased to have been invited back to talk about something maybe a little closer in my wheelhouse in terms of work I've been doing over the last few years, and that is on festivals in Europe in particular. So I'm joining you from Almo, Idaho at the Visitor Center for the City of Rocks National Reserve, where they have graciously granted me access to their Wi-Fi and a nice place to sit while I'm down here on vacation with my family. So thank you all for attending, and I've got a PowerPoint I will share with you. All right, hopefully you can all see that. The topic of my presentation today is a series of festivals that I'm studying currently in Belgium and writing about and doing active research on. For a dramatic title, I went with this, the Gilles, Giants and Dragons, Oh My, the reinvention of folkloric festivals in Belgium. And I'll get into what each of these terms are over the next hour. First, a brief introduction to Belgium. I usually do this because Belgium people tend to know it for chocolate or fries or waffles, but not a whole lot more. Belgium is a small country of about 11 million people. It's in Western Europe. It's centered between France, Holland, and Germany. It's often considered to be the battlefield of Europe for much of European history, at least from the mid 15th to the mid 20th centuries. It is it's a monarchy, so its government is very similar to that of Great Britain in the sense that it has a popular elected parliament with a head of state, which is a hereditary monarchy. However, it's in some ways more like the United States or even Germany in that it's a federal system. It's divided up into 3 federal regions, and these are really divided up. 2 of the 3 are divided up based on language. The northern half of Belgium is called Flanders. It's Flemish-based language. There are 5 provinces there. And then the southern half of the country is called Wallonia, and it is French-speaking. You can see the dividing line here. It's also made up of 5 provinces. In the middle is the capital, the city of Brussels, which is a separate federal region. It is officially bilingual, both Flemish, which is basically Dutch, and French-speaking, although it's about 85% French-speaking presently. My work centers in the province of Hainaut, or Hainaut, which is in the western part of Wallonia. You can see that there. It borders against. It's right up against the border of France. A brief history. I'll try to keep this as brief as possible, but it's really important, I think, to understand the significance of the rituals I'm looking at. The Low Countries, this shows a map of the Low Countries from the mid-16th or mid-15th, mid-16th, I guess, to mid-17th centuries. And you can see it's a kind of complicated series of provinces squeezed between the modern state of France and to the east would be Germany, or at the time, the Holy Roman Empire. It was made up of a series of provinces which were not controlled by either the German states or the French king. They were independent. Eventually, they would consolidate leadership under a single family. Many people would know this family. It's one of the most powerful families in European history, and that would be the Habsburgs. This man here, Charles V, was born in Belgium, in Ghent. Through family alliances and marriages, he would rise to become one of the most powerful rulers in Europe in the late or mid to late 16th century. He would be the Holy Roman Emperor, so of the German lands. He would also be King of Spain. His son, Philip II, is the one who sends the Great Armada against England. And he also is, of course, the overlord of these Low Countries, these kind of small, very wealthy, highly populous states in between France and the German states. two important things that happened to create the modern state of Belgium. This is the dominations of the House of Habsburg, and you can see kind of up in the north, the Netherlands or Low Countries here, and then to the east, the Holy Roman Empire, and to the south, the Spanish lands. On the death of Charles V, his son Philip would take control of Spain and the Spanish dominions, and while his brother Ferdinand would take control of the Holy Roman Empire. But both, so you'd have two different lines of the same Habsburg family. The Low Countries stayed with the Spanish, and the first major historical development happened also during the reign of Charles V, and that is the advent of Protestantism, particularly Calvinism, which took over the northern provinces. And eventually they rose in rebellion against the very pious and Spanish kings who were deeply Catholic, and over an 80-year period, from the 1570s to the 1640s, they fought for independence. And by the 1640s, you have an independent Dutch Republic to the north. The Spanish are able to hold on to what would be considered the state of Belgium. And this map here kind of shows you, this is in the late 18th century, but what's called the Austrian Netherlands there are the parts of the Low Countries which remain Catholic, and their Catholic identity is really central to my work. To the north is the Protestant Dutch, and then you can see the Holy Roman Empire and the French squeezed in there. The second significant impact is the French Revolution. The Austrian countries were seen as, eventually, after the die-off of the last of the Spanish the Spanish Habsburg kings, the Belgian lands were turned over to the Austrian Habsburg branch in the 18th century. And so they became the Austrian Netherlands. But they retained a lot of their independence, a lot of their autonomy. They were ruled by regency, but they were really self-governing and left alone. But they were, again, these were very strategic areas of Europe, very wealthy areas of Europe, and highly prized. And so a number of major battles that many people are familiar with, stretching from Waterloo in 1815 to the Battle of the Bulge in 1944, early 45. The Battle of Ypres during the First World War. Belgium becomes this kind of staging ground between the British and the French and the different German states over this period. So back to where we are. Belgium becomes an independent state in 1830 after the end of the Revolution, or the Napoleonic Wars. And I'm studying a series of festivals in this province of Hainaut. Why? Well, I was doing work in Belgium in the early 2000s on a doctoral research project for my dissertation, and I was actually studying the French-Belgian borderland and the communities on the borderland. And in the course of that, I made a number of friends in Belgium, and they kept inviting me to over the course of the year I was living there, to many different festivals. It was something of a distraction from my doctoral work, but a really pleasant, welcoming distraction. And I started asking questions. Why are they dressed this way? Why do they have giants? Why is there a Saint Roch statue? Why do all these things exist? Why is there so much popular participation in them? And when I finished my dissertation, I was looking for a second project, and kind of lit on the idea of looking at something that had received relatively little interest, at least in English-speaking history. So I formulated a research project presentation for the Fulbright organization, which is part of the US State Department, in 2018, and made my application. And in 2019, I was granted a 6-month research grant starting in January 1st of 2020, lasting 6 months. And I arrived in Belgium shortly before that, and began my research. And I was able to research there for about 2.5 months until the middle of March 2020. I think we all know what happened at that point. On March 12th and 13th, Belgium basically shut down completely. The Fulbright program also shut down, and all grantees were sent home, and then international travel was suspended. So I wasn't able to complete my project, and I'm hoping to return next summer, or even potentially in the future Fulbright, to complete my research. But what I wanted to present today was a brief version of what I managed to accomplish in the time I was there. So we're going to look at a few different types of festivals in Belgium. I've divided up into what I would call 3 different regions of this one little province of Hainaut. In the far western areas is the region of the giants, West Hainaut. And there are two we can look at briefly today. They're called a Ducasse. A Ducasse is a French word which comes from the word dedicace, and a dedicace is a saint processional, or a ritualized communal religious processional, carrying typically either a relic of a saint or a statue of a saint, or sometimes both, around the city, typically on the saint's special day of the year. It's a very Catholic thing. It's, in some ways, it relates to what's called the cult of saints, starting with Saint Mary, but all sorts of other saints. And in this Western area, what we see in these dedicaces, or the Ducasses, is they evolve into these giant festivals. In one case, in the city of Ath, giants as in the Goliath and Samson, and then a person playing David fighting Goliath. And then in the city of Mons, dragons. And what eventually evolves in that, from that saint processional, is a ritualized combat between a giant green dragon in the city and someone playing Saint George on horseback. In the middle of the province, it's the region of Carnival, and it centers on a small, beautiful medieval town called Binche, B-I-N-C-H-E, and they're very famous marchers of their carnival celebration, who are called Gilles. And I'll talk a bit about the origin and peculiarness and uniqueness of the Gilles. It starts in Binche, but the Binche tradition of carnival are very specific. When we think of carnival, we typically think of Mardi Gras, as in New Orleans, Mardi Gras with floats and different crews doing these floats and marching bands. Or if in South America, the Rio-based one, or elsewhere in Europe would be the Venetian version of carnival with the Commedia dell'arte masking. This is a very unique, the most well-known carnival in Belgium, and it's spread from Binche throughout the region, and kind of other towns began imitating that carnival. And then to the farthest east of the region, we call it the region of Saint Military Marches. Again, these are like the dedicaces. They start out as marches dedicated to a specific saint. In this area was a very militarized area, and a lot of warfare happened. It was very strategic. It fell on the line of the Meuse River and the Solms River, which eventually feed into the Rhine. And it's a mountainous area around the Ardennes, and there are big fortresses there. And so when they did these saint marches there, they wanted protection, military protection of the marchers, and most importantly of the relics and statues themselves. So what you see in this area are dozens, if not 100 different marches, military marches that span from late spring all the way to early fall every year. Why did I pick these? I picked them because they fit a standardized model of research. All of them have been given UNESCO cultural heritage status as intangible heritage of humanity. The Carnival of Bash first in 2003, followed by the two Ducasses, that of Mons and Ath in 2005 and 8, and then eventually 6 of the military marches of Saint Roch in 2012. All of these festivals are still celebrated today. They all have museums dedicated to them. They have folkloric commemorative organizations, and they've been given formal recognition, both locally within their region, like in their federal region, at a national level, and then even with UNESCO at an international level. So let's get into it. Here's the first of the 4. This is in the city of Mons. What you're looking at is a Gothic collegial church. It's not a cathedral. It's a gorgeous church. I lived in the city of Mons during my Fulbright. In fact, I walked by this church almost every single day. On Trinity Sunday, which is typically the first Sunday in June, they have what's called the processional of Mons, the returning of this special carriage with the relics of a saint to the church. And this church is named after the saint to which it's dedicated, Saint Doudou, who was a woman from the 7th century. And they still have a relic remains today, which is quite amazing. This is the Ducasse part of it, the beginning of it. That is to say that what happened in this town is each year, starting with the Black Death in 1349, they began carrying the relics of the saint around the city, physically creating a protective layer or prophylactic protection around the city by marching through all of the major avenues within the city walls, and then eventually even outside of the city walls to protect it, often from disease, but also from warfare. At the end of this processional, the chariot, which you'll see shortly, is pushed back up a ramp into the church. And the local folkloric tradition is it can't stop. If it pauses, something bad will happen to the town in the next year. And local tradition holds that the last time it stopped was in 1940, just before the war. Shortly thereafter, it's followed by what's called the Lumason. More typically in English be the combat of St. George and the dragon. And here we see the dragon. It's being held by a bunch of men dressed in white. There's also what are called wild men or leaf men. They're dressed in green. They help carry the tail at the back of it. They are opposed by a group of men called the Chinchins, and I'll show you pictures of them, as well as St. George on horseback, who's played by a human actor. In this combat, it takes place in the Grand Place, or the central plaza of the city, on the same day as the procession. And you can see that there's virtually no cordon between the participants of the ritual and the spectator, upwards of over 10,000 people in this plaza alone. And the closest circle are typically young men. Typically they take their shirts off and they try to fight to steal the hair of the dragon on its tail, which is made of horsehair. And it's considered a great honor to be able to pull a chunk of horsehair out. So they spin this dragon around the circle while people grab and push and jostle with one another to get this hair. I was invited to participate in this, of course, in 2020. That this festival didn't happen. Eventually, after a series of mock ritualized combat moves between St. George and the dragon is dispatched with a pair of pistols, which tells you that this is not just a medieval processional. And then it's put back in the church, in a cave underneath the church, to wait for the following year. The origins of this date to this woman, Saint Doudou, who is a very interesting saint. She lived in the 7th century in the city of Mons. She was a mother. She was married. She had 2 daughters. You can see them here in this 18th century painting. Eventually, she retires and forms a monastic style community known as a canoness, which has quite a little less rigor to it than being a formal nun. It's a religious community where you still take vows, but it's more open to it's not a cloistered system where you live within walls and never emerge. Upon her death, she was named a saint, and her body was preserved in relic form and then commemorated eventually with the great non-cathedral church of Saint Doudou. Her body was separated between the head and the regular body. The head, also known as the chasse, and the body are on display in the church all year long. And then on the day before the processional, they are brought down into this chariot here, which was made in the 18th century. And they're put inside this chariot, and then they go around this community. In the Middle Ages, following this chariot would be all the guilds of the city, dressed in their medieval or early Renaissance in some ways, gear, costuming, and they would follow along behind the religious processional, and that would declare to the community their importance, their worth, their status. Typically, they would also be aligned with certain saints, most notably Saint Roch, who's the patron saint of disease. And as I said, this really originated as a processional during the Black Death. So there are some connections between the epidemic of 2020 in Mons and what happened in 1348, 1349. So if you were watching this and you say, okay, what's going on here? On the one hand, we have this veritable relic of this holy woman who was named a saint. How did that get to a dragon? And that goes in a different direction. This is a 15th century painting of St. George slaying the dragon. St. George was would have lived in modern day Turkey at the time under the Roman Empire. And he supposedly, while stationed there, fought and killed a dragon, and then also was canonized as a saint and became notably associated with the kings of England in the Middle Ages. St. George is still patron saint of England, the Red Cross flag of England. And at the time of the Middle Ages, in this community, the county of Hainaut was a very powerful county, and eventually Edward III, the King of England, married the daughter of the Count of Hainaut. And so there's this English influence into the county. And that's how we begin to associate this noble order of St. George in the city of Mons. And then a more strange thing happens. Supposedly, this man named Gilles de Chin, notice the commonality of the name Gilles, and we'll reference that back to the Carnival of Bash later. This is a 12th century knight. He also went on crusade to Egypt with the Count of Hainaut, and on his return, he supposedly killed a dragon outside of Mons. This is in the museum for the Ducasse of Mons. They have brought in his funerary statue, so you can view it. And then also the mummified head of a crocodile known as the dragon's head, which we believe he brought back from Egypt on crusade. We know that's documented as early as 1409. And so two things are happening here. On the one hand, we have this the Canonesque chapter of Saint Wadru, and then the Black Death in the 14th century. On the other hand, we also have this highly noble order dedicated to dragon killing that eventually want to bring that into this processional. Here's the city of Mons. You can see the Grand Place here and the great cathedral up here. And so it would emerge from this cathedral, move through these different squares, and then the combat would take place on the Grand Place after the processional. One of the earliest images we have of it is this picture, or this painting from the late 18th century in 1795. It says La Lumière Mons at the bottom. This is during the French Revolution. It's a minimized painting, but you can see on the Grand Place of this town, you can see St. George with his lance. You can also see the dragon. There are some of the wild men and devils. There are also devils that carry these little inflated bags. They're dressed in black, and they're a common element in popular festivals in Europe. And then over here, the protector of St. George, the Chin-Chins, named after Gilles de Chin himself. And so you see that here. Well, one common element we'll see in all of these rituals is they run into some difficulties in the 18th century with religious authorities and with secular authorities. Almost all these rituals will start out as obviously as religious processionals, marching people with relics through cities. And then you see this popular attachment onto it. With the dragon example, what we see is kind of a noble attachment to it. This order of St. George, which had its chapter house on the Grand Place itself, which has this connection back to Gilles de Chin, the dragon killer, and back to Edward III, who had a presence in Mons. And so the dragon aspect has no religious aspect to the processional itself, but becomes in some ways far more popular than the Saint Wadru processional. So in the late 18th century, these become kind of chaotic and uncontrolled. Groups of people get very excited about it. They start, much like the picture I showed you, they start to break down rules. We see reports of dancing and drunkenness in the streets, lots of music, multiple day festivals, and the religious authorities get really upset about this. It's supposed to be a pious ritual, not a profane ritual. It's supposed to be a positive ritual, meaning you're doing something, and you're doing something to protect this community. And it's being co-opted by this popular secular element, both high society in terms of the St. George people and low society in terms of the spectators. And so you begin to see increasing regulation of this. And this regulation occurs in all of these festivals, actually, up in the 20 years before the French Revolution by local authorities, particularly in this case, the Austrian authorities who are controlling the Low Countries. And then, of course, the French Revolution will come in. And in 1794, these revolutionary armies will sweep through Belgium and conquer it. And Belgium will remain part of the French Empire, First Republic, and then Empire until 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. And initially, they're very anti-church, and they come through revolutionaries. They burn churches, they destroy relics, they melt down all the metal, they close all of the monasteries, burn them down as well in some cases, and then forbid all rituals that have any religious, particularly Catholic element to it. And that affects all of these. And when we're looking at the post-revolutionary legacy, it takes 50 to 60 years for many of these rituals to recover back to, and when they recover, they change. That's this reinvention process. They're not the same. There's something fundamentally different about these rituals in the late 19th century than how they had been practiced prior to the French Revolution. Here, this is the Belgian Centenary, 100-year centenary of the anniversary of its 100-year independence. We can see the combat of St. George and the Dragon. Again, we can see this early version of this green dragon with this long tail, St. George on horseback. A lot of people watching as spectators, kind of chaos, people falling down. You see the chin with the kind of mock horse around their bodies. They're supposed to protect St. George against the wild men and against the devils. Here's a 1858 version of the dragon himself. You can see the white men carrying him. The chin-chins now are dressed in plaid. You can see there eventually there'll be up to 11 of these chin-chins. You can see the devils, which are on the ground with their inflatable bags, and then of course the wild men with their clubs. And this again shows, this is on the Grand Place in Mons, so it shows again the what's called the Lumaçon, or the combat. And this is a post-World War II era version, 1949, but they use this print multiple times. This is in 1962. And you can see it by this point, it has been modernized. Now you see the Belgian flag all over the red, black, and yellow flag of Belgium. You see the combat. You see many of these elements have been preserved. So you get this notion that we have this continuity between 1795 and nearly 100 years later. And then 100 years after that, and by 1962. Second of my rituals is in a nearby city of Ath, A-T-H, also a military city, a fortress city, also under the purview of the Counts of Hainaut. They go in a different direction, but it follows a similar line. In the 14th and early 15th centuries, they're also doing a Ducasse or Dédicace. In this case, they're celebrating a couple saints. First, the saint of the city, St. Julian, and then also a saint from the Bible, St. Christopher. St. Christopher is typically associated with a great height or stature. And so you see the attempts by the local community. Again, we see secular innovation into a religious processional. They can begin making statues to commemorate both St. Julian, but more so St. Christopher. By around 1481, you see the first mention of Goliath as a statue of the Old Testament, and of a mock battle, much like we see in Mons, but this time with a giant and someone playing David who throws rocks and defeats Goliath. We see the addition of more giants later in the 16th and 17th centuries. We see in the records, both Samson appears, an eagle appears, and all of these giants are being built by what we call a confraternity, which are basically lay brothers. Like, these are not religious people, but they have a religious association, almost like a Masonic lodge today, but a Catholic association. And they were associated also with their guilds. And in this case in Ath, because it was a military city, with the defenders of the city, the Guild of Archers, the Guild eventually of Cannoneers, the guilds of crossbowmen who defend the city itself. And they build these giants. By the 18th century, we see the addition of a female character, Madame Goliath. And on the day of the festival, which happens in late August, Goliath comes out and he marries Madame Goliath. So you have this mock marriage, and combined marriage is a sacrament in the Catholic Church, but between two artificial figures in this case. And then subsequently, David defeats Goliath in a mock combat afterwards. Here's another picture of Goliath and his bride. And in this case, in 2012, typically David is played by a child, and typically a child of one of the groups that are associated with building and moving and maintaining the giants around the city. And so in this case, there's David of 2012 who throws his rocks. He has 3 chances to get it in this little hole in David's armor to bring good fortune to the city. The giants meet the same fate in the French Revolution. In 1794, the revolutionaries invade There's a popular society or a revolutionary society in the city of Ath who petitions to see religion removed from their rituals. They want to go to more civic communal rituals, like what are associated with the French Revolution, celebrating the nation rather than celebrating religious associations at a local level. And so they burn all the giants. They're destroyed in an auto da fe on the date that they should have been marching in August of 1794. But after Napoleon ends the Republic and creates the empire in 1804, he also reaches a concordat with the Pope, and we see a slow restoration of Catholic practices and worship in France and in areas conquered by France, such as Belgium. And so the giants are rebuilt in 1806, and by 1809, you start to see a reemergence of this ritual, but very tightly controlled. It doesn't look anything like what the old ritual looked at like before the revolution. By 1843, we see a new Goliath in this picture. A century later, this is Goliath with the same head, but changing body types in 1945. And now, today, if you go to the museum at Ath, it's called the Maison des Géants, or House of Giants. You can see in the interim time when they're not marching the giants, you can go see how they're constructed. Here's a picture of my wife with Madame Goliath at the Maison des Géants. So that's the giant processional. What is notable about the giant processional is that one notable difference after the French Revolution is that it's no longer a religious association with it. It's run by the city government. It's paid for by the city government. It's stored by the city government. The people who work on the giants and carry the giants do so without any sort of religious connection. So it completely removes itself from the sacred religious elements that had been associated with it before the revolution. My third example, I want to get through these pretty quickly. One of my favorites, one I did a lot of work on when I was in Belgium last February and January, is the Carnival of Binche. And the Carnival of Binche, if you don't know, carnivals are kind of an anti-ritual or inverted ritual. It comes right before Lent. Lent begins on Ash Wednesday and lasts for 40 days until Easter. And Lent in the Catholic liturgy is what we would call a negative ritual. You abstain from doing something. It's sacred but negative, meaning you don't do something, like for instance give up fish or give up something else as part of as worshiping of Christ between Ash Wednesday and Easter. And Carnival emerges in the Middle Ages as the last great hurrah before this negative ritual happens. So in this case, Carnival is a positive ritual. You are doing something, but it's profane. It's not run by the church at all. It's a popular ritual, typically celebrating what we call the lower body: eating, gluttony, drinking, music, dancing, sex. All of these things are celebrated in Carnival. We see carnival celebrations all across Europe during this time. And in Belgium, there were many different carnivals. And so the part of the whole story of this is why this carnival, how did it become the most important carnival and the single archetypal form of carnival that Belgium would then celebrate in the 19th and 20th centuries. The earliest archival references to carnival we have in Belgium are from the 14th century. You can see that it was run by the commune, the city government in some ways, and as this great celebration leading right up to Lent. In this picture, it's a picture I took of the Pirot, and this is a children's marching group. And this looks very much like a Venetian carnival scene. You can see the pointed hats, the black masks, the pastel colors. And this is one of the modern day groups that march, and they have a special day, Sunday. So when we think of Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, that's the day before Ash Wednesday. In typical carnival, it's not just that day. There's also the Monday, the Sunday, and the Saturday preceding it are also celebration days. Again, much like we see with the two previous festivals, it's on the Grand Place in the center square. The highlight of Carnival are really the Gilles, and these are the Gilles here. And they wear, and part of the day they wear this mask, other parts of the way they don't have a mask on, instead they have this very famous headdress. And the Gilles, to be a Gilles, you have to be what used to be a native born son of the town of Binche. Nowadays, if you just live in Binche for 5 years and are a man, you can participate as a Gilles. It's a very expensive endeavor. Gilles were typically drawn from the bourgeoisie, the middle class. This was initially a guild city. It had a lot of textiles. Eventually, it would become a mining city in the 19th century and still had a fair amount of wealth. So the Gilles wear this wax mask that's from the 19th century. It has eyeglasses and a very 19th century mustache. But another part, later in the day, they will take the masks off and wear this famous headdress made of ostrich plumes. And they will march through the city in this very famous, distinctive medieval costume, and they will throw oranges to the spectators. And you're considered lucky if you catch one. They have to actually put chicken wire up over all of the windows in the Grand Place for fear of breaking. We're talking thousands and thousands of oranges being thrown through the city. You can't throw them back at the Gilles, by the way, it's forbidden. So today there are about a dozen different societies of Gilles. They all wear the same outfit on Mardi Gras itself, Fat Tuesday. They all follow the same ritual, and they all have to be native-born sons of the town. That Fat Tuesday starts early in the morning. It's a picture of me with two of these Gilles. This is taken at about 5 in the morning. They wake up in the pre-dawn blackness, and the oldest Gilles of each society is honored first, and a drummer will appear at his house and a fifer will appear at his house, and then he moves to the next house and he'll pick up the next oldest and then the next oldest until the entire group is assembled of, it could be upwards of 80 different men. And then they will move into the Grand Place by around 9 a.m. At each house they stop and they have a little tiny bit of champagne. It's forbidden to be drunk as a Gilles. So it's kind of in some ways an inverse of Carnival. They're very, very regulated, very standardized, very controlled, and very revered. And the Gilles, they dance and march in these very famous costumes, and then eventually they throw oranges, and they're feted and celebrated through the town on the day of Mardi Gras. The day ends after midnight, so they're up and they're on their feet. They're not allowed to sit down or sleep. They're on their feet from about 4 in the morning all the way to midnight of the next day. So it's a pretty serious endeavor. This is one of the last festivals that happened in Belgium before the shutdown, the Carnival of Bash of 2020 in late February of last year. The carnival, we also can thank the French Revolution for understanding something about this carnival. It was also banned by the French revolutionaries, and a protest happened, and a man named François Gaillard showed up in the archives say in the habit or manner of a Gilles, as in the costume of a Gilles. And that's the first reference we have to the Gilles, is in around 1795, about the same year as that picture of the combat of dragons in Mons. And much like these other festivals, we see tight regulation, first outright banning by the revolutionaries, then after Napoleon and the overthrow of Napoleon, a slow relaxation, but still continued tight control of these festivals until around 1850. And then we see reinvention after that. This is a picture of the hats that are in storage. I had a chance to go meet this man. He's called a louagère. His name is Carl Kirsten. His family's been hand making these Gilles costumes since the mid-19th century. And then you have this kind of historical commemoration of them. The Gilles in 1875. This is Auguste Gaillard, the nephew to that one who protested in the French Revolution. This is a picture of him. It's a very formalized picture. You can see the hat, they're holding the oranges. They're wearing the very famous, what they call the double hunchback outfit, where it's stuffed with straw in the front and the back. The curious origin story of the Gilles really comes out in the late 19th century, and it relates back to what we call the Spanish legend. Remember, I said Belgium was controlled by the Spanish, not the French, before the Revolution. And a woman named Mary of Hungary, she had married the King of Hungary, and after his death, she moved to Belgium as the regent of the Low Countries. She was sister to Charles V from the beginning of my slides, and she built a palace in Binche in 1549. That palace no longer exists today. And supposedly she had a festival there in the summer of 1549, a very famous festival. She invited her brother and nephew, the future king of Spain, and they celebrated for 2 weeks. And during that, supposedly, they either brought Incan warriors from the conquest of Peru into the palace, or they had local people dressed as Incan warriors to celebrate the conquest of Peru. And that's the explanation for the great hats, these plumed hats. And they even go as far to say, looking at the costuming of the costume itself with all of its very intricate detail work on the tunic and the leggings, that these might represent the tattoos of a Native American. Now, of course, we have no historical evidence to suggest this is true or not. But what it tells you is this attempt in the late 19th century to find historical origins to these celebrations, which go back to the Middle Ages. And in some ways, because they're folkloric and because they're not as well documented, they're lost to the annals of time. They're oral traditions passed down that are not documented. And so there's this work by folklorists and archivists and others in the late 19th century to say, well, why do they wear these hats? Why do they throw these oranges? Where do they get these costumes? And this 1549 celebration of Mary of Hungary in Bash really stood out of the historical gloom as a likely possible source for this. You see this again, which is my last, I'll try to finish this up in 5 minutes so I can take questions. The last of my examples, and these are the military marches of East Hainaut. There are, as I said, almost 100 of them. 6 of them were dedicated as UNESCO or acknowledged by UNESCO, and I picked 2 of those 6 to study. They're both dedicated to Saint Roch. Saint Roch is the patron saint of disease. We see that we've seen him appear before in Mons to protect against the Black Death. And what happens in this area, of Eastern Belgium, is the plague breaks out in the 16th century, in 1636 to be very specific. And a bunch of chapels to Saint Roch are constructed, and they start doing processionals with statues of Saint Roch to try to save the town from death. And of course, these towns are all dead. It wasn't just in 1349, the plague continues all the way to the 18th century, generationally. Every 20, 30 years, another outbreak in the same town will occur. And so today, well, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, they wanted to take the statue of Saint Roch out and tour the town to give this prophylactic protection of the city by carrying it around the city limits and then throughout the city. But they also wanted to protect the statue. So they started using city militias, carrying initially like swords and axes, but eventually muskets to protect the statue. So that's where they become military saint marches. It's not just the saint that does it, there's a military aspect to it. This is a picture of my son and wife doing what's called the torchlit march of the night of the Saint Roch processional, where the whole town, doesn't matter if you're a military member of one of these organizations or a member of the clergy, everybody has a right to take a torch, even visiting Americans, it turns out, and walk the route that will be taken the following day by the marching organizations. And that's what's going on here. When the marchers appear, they're dressed in Napoleonic costumes. And this was one of my questions. If this march goes back to this early 17th century, shouldn't they be wearing 17th century costumes? Why are they all dressed up as if they just came back from Waterloo? And the story I was told was, well, after the Napoleonic Wars, of which many Belgian men were conscripted into, they came back and they had their uniforms, and they just used those uniforms to continue the Saint Roch March, which makes sense, except for one big problem, and that is these marches were also banned by the French revolutionaries. And unlike the other examples I've talked about today, they did not come back after the war. After Waterloo, these marches were still banned until the 1850s. And the first reemergence of them is in the 1860s. So the next question is, well, then why Napoleonic uniforms? And these are gorgeous Napoleonic uniforms. We're talking 2,000 men and women today. Historically, this was done. These were just men that marched. Women were given a special place, but it was a non-military place in the processionals. Today, we've seen integration of men and women into the marches. And they organize, much like the Gilles have different societies of Gilles, or in the combat of Mons, we have the different groups that hang out together, the Chin Chins and St. George, the white men and the leaf men, wild men, they hang out socially and create organizations. Here we have different marching groups, upwards of 15 to 20, depending on the march. And each of these marching groups also includes a band, and these are highly trained musical marchers. And then in this case, we can see a Sapper Regiment. A Sapper Regiment is basically a military engineering regiment that would create, for instance, trenches, redoubts, and other aspects for, say, artillery combat. And that's where a lot of Belgian men found their place in the Napoleonic Wars. And then the last group, the people who are allowed to carry the statue of Saint Roch, are called the Zouaves. And the Zouaves Pontificaux means the papal Zouave. In this case, they're dressed as if they're North African military units from the 19th century. In fact, what happened was the different Belgian groups sent assistance to the Pope in Rome during the Italian unification efforts in the 1870s, and that reflects their military costume. And they carry the actual statue of Saint Roch, which you can see here. And each day it's returned back to its chapel, and then the march goes on for 4 or 5 days. One interesting aspect to this, and kind of close on this so I can take some questions, is how, much like what we see with the Carnival of Bash, we see kind of a reinvention of tradition, of the historical origins. And one of these examples in Thuan, the city of Thuan, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, they reinvent the origins of their march. You'll notice here, this says, this is a May 1907, pamphlet for the march. And it says 40th anniversary, which would say that the first anniversary would have started in 1867, which it did, of the modern march. But later on, within 10 years of this one, they will reconnect the march back to the 17th century and remove that kind of interim period of the French Revolution to 1867. And all of a sudden it's the 250th. When I last attended one of these marches, it was the 367th. And they ignore this big kind of gap in the middle of the 70-year gap in the march. And they also relocated the march itself from the outbreak of plague to a warfare example to explain the military units. In 1654, the city of Thuan was put under siege by the Spanish, and miraculously, disease struck the Spanish army, and that led to this commemoration of Saint Roch. Saint Roch, in this case, protected the city by inflicting disease on the besiegers. And they reconstructed their history around that event of 1654, much like the 1549 event in Bash became this moment of historical clarity for explaining the military uniforms as necessary for the Saint Roch processional. Here we see the Zouave Pontificaux in the 1920s. You can see that it's not fully standardized yet. In this case, we have people dressed in, this would be like pre-World War II, the Belgian Congo military uniforms. In 1933, we see a marching band. We see this cannon, which in historical tradition, they say the city of Thuan claimed from the Spanish, and they called the cannon Spanish, Spantol. But it turns out this cannon wasn't claimed by the Spanish. It wasn't even owned by the Spanish. It was in the city inventory prior to the siege. So we have this kind of creation of tradition or creation of historical intervention in some of these examples. So I'm going to wrap up there. I think the last thing I wanted to say is there's some common themes here. We see religious origins, particularly disease and plague, as a common element to the origins of these rituals. These communities are in crisis and strife, and they're looking for some control or agency over these events, and they turn to religious elements, particularly saint worship. We see popular secular appropriation of these rituals, which leads to tension, both with religious authorities and secular authorities over disturbances and civic problems, as well as public drunkenness and fighting and dancing and things like that. There are a lot of crossover elements to these rituals. We see wild men in the combat of Mons, but also we see them actually in Ath with the giants. We see St. George in both of these. We see St. Roch across all of them in many ways. The torchlit marches, which were part of the military marches, are then appropriated back by the combat in Mons. We see this big crisis of the revolution and the post-revolutionary era, and then a recovery in the later 19th century. And this turn to the creation of origin legends, often going back to the Spanish occupation. We see standardization, and in this case, the 1930 centenary is really important to standardize these rituals. There's crisis in the 1960s and 70s, particularly driven by economic crisis in Belgium as the decline of the coal and iron industry, but then recovery and UNESCO status. And then we see new challenges. For instance, what status do women have in these typically exclusively male rituals. And in the case of the military marches, we see an open acceptance of women into the ranks. So I want to stop there and leave about 10 minutes for questions. So that's Doug, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for all that information. It was quite a wonderful presentation. Definitely learned a lot. The first question I wanted to ask was, in the military marches, there was kind of an obvious influence from other, people and other cultures, case in point, the North African uniforms and the uniforms from Napoleon. Was there other influences on these other festivals, even ones you didn't talk about, since Belgium kind of acted as that, battlefield for all of Europe to just kind of, navigate through?
Yeah, I mean, for instance, in the Carnival of Bash, there's a lot of associations of the costume, which are assumed in some people. Some associations have been that they have these dramatically Spanish origins. Where are they getting the oranges from? Well, the assumption is they're getting them from Valencia, which is a Spanish province. They're being brought up into early spring, up into Belgium because of the Spanish trade networks and the Spanish road up to Belgium. And then they're seen as these like enormously treasured artifacts in a pre-industrial world to have access in late winter to fresh oranges, which are then thrown by the community, by these Gilles out to the community, and the kind of exoticness of the headdress itself as Native American, in fact. And that being said, there's been, in the last 30 years, there's been a lot of research on this, and the jury's still out, but a lot of historians are pushing back against the Incan origin concept and say, well, maybe it's more local. Maybe people in Bash did this on their own, but it's clear that it's because of this access to the Spanish trade, to Mediterranean trade, to have ostrich feathers, to have oranges, that you can see the foreign influences. In the St. Roch marches with the Napoleonic uniforms, they're often dressing up as French regiments of the Napoleonic, the highest, like the imperial, Napoleon's imperial guard, are represented there. So on the one hand, they carry these Belgian flags, on the other hand, they see themselves as part of the French Empire, or are commemorating their participation in the French imperial struggles of the early 19th century. So in those cases, yes, there are a lot of foreign elements.
And speaking of local, I was wondering if you can talk about kind of using folklore as, part of your identity, whether it's, as like a personal identity, or from what I've kind of gathered is that all these cities have these festivals as part of what makes their city unique.
It is central to their identity. I mean, even more in Boise, for instance, if you're from Boise, you probably know the Hayaldi celebration, which is, I think, every 5 years, isn't it every 5 years, 3 or 5 years, which is a Basque celebration in the Basque Quarter in Boise. And it's enormously influential and significant to the Basque community, but also to the city of Boise. This is like that times magnitude. You have thousands and thousands of people that participate in each of these rituals. And they're also major tourist draws. And what you see is a lot of cross-fertilization. Like when I was in Belgium last year, I became friends with a fifer in one of the military marches who was being hired by one of the Gilles in Carnival to be his fifer for the Carnival celebration. So he was going over to work in Bash as for Carnival, but then later on in the year, back in May, he would go back and wear his Napoleonic uniform and be in a marching band there as well. So I would argue, and I had so much positive interaction and response when I told people what I was doing in Belgium. There was this enormous kind of, not just gratitude towards me, but happiness that there was an international recognition of the folkloric significance of these traditions, and that these could be shared beyond the kind of immediate French-speaking world that they lived in. And so I had a lot of doors open. I was invited to all of these festivals to watch them firsthand, to meet the people of the organizations, to come into the museums and work in them. So I have a lot of gratitude towards the different Belgian organizations, but they have really taken folklore to a next level. They have made folklore the centerpiece, the front and center part of their civic identity and individual identity. I didn't get into some of those slides, but some of those later slides, they show a grandfather and a grandson who have been in the same regiment dating back to the 19th century, and whose son will be in the next level of the regiment and is already dressed in a children's uniform. So you see these genealogies of people that are attached to folklore.
Yeah, I was gonna say you talked about that tradition with age and direct ties to the town. So definitely seems like who's been here the longest really plays a role into that hierarchy. And like you said, the child pretty much already being a part of it because the entire family has been. There's that sense of pride there. I think that's really interesting and really cool.
And they've, in some ways democratized these rituals. Some of them were seen really elitist in the 1950s and 60s, and kind of old to a younger generation, really an Americanized generation, post-war baby boomer today generation, who really in the 1950s and 60s started to reject these rituals as kind of archaic and sexist and traditional. And in response, the folklore evolved in response to them. For instance, in Mons, up until the 1960s, all of those people that acted on the combat were paid actors, and typically lower class paid actors. And by the late 1960s, the whole festival kind of started to get this seedy aspect to it of public drunkenness and kind of lower class interest. And like people didn't know what was going on, they were just being paid. And so they renewed the whole festival in the 1970s and said, we're no longer going to hire people to do this. And we're going to invite people to do this, and we'll take applications. And all of a sudden it wasn't become class-based, but it became much more people from lower classes and upper classes and the middle class all found dignity and restraint in what they were doing. And you see that with the Gilles, who move carnival in a very different direction in Belgium than you see other places where the spectators can drink and dance and do these things, but the participants themselves are very, very, very dignified. And you see the same generationally. You see that with the Gilles, the son of a Gilles is a Gilles. From a racial perspective, the first black Gilles, a black man from the Congo who had moved to Belgium in the 1960s happened. And so you do see opening of doors, that it's not just about native born sons from a racialized perspective that can be Gilles, anyone. And they deal with the issue of gender by saying with the carnival, for instance, that every Gilles has to have a woman who helps him through the week, who dresses him, and that seems, to our eyes, I think to some extent, not knowing how this works, still seems kind of paternalistic. And perhaps it is, but the women that participate in this see this great dignity to it, and testified before the UNESCO hearings to say, no, we feel we are equal actors in this ritual. It's inclusive to us. It couldn't happen without us. And so we're happy going forward not to be a Gilles. Now, we'll see what happens in the next generation.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point that you brought up with the women that are involved is, to us from our perspective, it can seem very, subservient almost, but to them, in their perspective, like you said, they feel that they're equally involved, in the customs. And I think that's just something that's really important to keep in mind, especially since we are becoming more of a globalized society and, having access to all these customs like the ones you talked about that normally we wouldn't. It's just, as long as they're okay with it and recognize that that's what matters, because it's from their perspective.
Yeah, it's easy to judge. And so when I was in Binche, I talked to a lot of women and almost every woman I met was une femme, a woman of a Gilles. And sometimes she was a woman, but it's weird because we use that term kind of in a literal translation, but a Gilles woman could be a sister, a mother, a grandmother, a wife, of course, sometimes a daughter. And typically it was family related, sometimes a friend. I knew a woman who was a woman who and her husband was best friends with this Gilles, and but the Gilles himself was single and didn't have someone to help him, so she offered to be his person. And so it does take some time to try to deconstruct and figure out, okay, at what level is this equitable and at what level is this not, and what role do I as an outsider have to say about that?
Yeah. Well, looks like we are out of time, unfortunately, but thank you again for all the information, wonderful presentation, and everything you've been doing with the IHC.
Thank you, Doug. Thanks to everybody who participated, who listened. Thank you for your questions. And I encourage you all to go visit Belgium when you can, safely do so, and experience these for yourself. It's a really fun place.
All right, well, have a good one, everyone.
Thank you.